Time to start properly. So thank you. Welcome to this Street Drugs Discussions. This time we are looking into drug trafficking and policing, and we have two very wonderful expert guests to join on these two topics. So I'll briefly introduce the guests before inviting the guests to introduce themselves. But before that, I will give a little bit of preamble. So yeah, we are starting now. The maximum will go on to us in 2 o'clock, although probably I imagine it'll run out of steam a little bit earlier, maybe 22 or something like that. So we'll start by, I will ask each of our experts to give a bit of an opening gambit onto their knowledge, experiences and interest into the topic. And then hopefully things will work in quite a discussion-y sort of a way. We've got some bullet points to run through. But the best way I always find to structure discussion is through questions and points made by those who have attended. So you will notice we have a chat and we have a Q&A, and you can chuck your questions into either. Sometimes we get through the kind of pre-decided discussion points and then do a full-on Q&A. Very often, though, a question is kind of so good and relevant to the current discussion, I kind of chuck it in then, and that's kind of when we end up structuring discussion around the points. So any questions, any points to Lucy and Neil, do chuck them in. Either I'll jump straight in and ask that question, or I will eventually come to it. And if I haven't asked it for ages, ask it again, since it's much more likely I've forgotten about it than decided to ignore it. I cannot think of any more preamble we need really, so I'll start, I think, Lucy. So Lucy is a PhD candidate in criminology at Edinburgh University, or I believe is studying by distance and not joining us from Edinburgh. So please, Lucy, do come and tell us about yourself, your experiences, interests, and knowledge in this topic.
Thank you very much, James. Yes, so as you've said, I am a criminologist and PhD student. I'm a feminist criminologist in that my research is very ethically based on giving people who are marginalised a voice. I'm also a lived experience criminologist. I have served 7 years in prison, and so my research is very much based around my own experiences in prison and the things I saw there, and looking to see how I can change the system now from the inside rather than changing it by being an absolute rascal on the outside. So my way, I'll give you a bit of background about how I got myself into such chaos. So I had quite a meandering route into academia. I was brought up on a council estate in Cornwall, and I came from a house that had quite a lot of abuse and chaos and mental health issues. And so when I was 16 years old, I'd run away from home loads of times, and I kept getting bounced back in. The police would pick me up, or social services would pick me up, and they'd throw me back in the house. And now, how many times I tried to get away, I was just chucked back there. But this was the early 90s, mind, and they didn't quite have the systems in place that they have now. So when I was 16, the day I turned 16, pretty much, I moved out. I got myself a wee bed set, and I found myself a little community of other outliers and young people, essentially, who were very much into the rave scene and partying and doing lots of drugs. And I loved it. It was I found myself a little home away from home, and I started to sell bits of weed and sell ease and whatever we could get our hands on, essentially, just to fund my lifestyle and put food in the cupboards. I suppose there was no well, got a gyro, but that was about it. So I spent the next 10 years pretty much just selling drugs, being a street pharmacist, as I used to say, and really enjoyed myself. Don't get me wrong, I was a lost little soul at the time. I had no family that was looking after me, no one to connect with, transient friends. I moved around quite a lot, and yeah, I was kind of untethered. You know, there was nothing there that I could base a home on, so to speak. But I had there was lots of parties going on back then. It was, you know, 1990s, late 90s by this point. So I just enjoyed the rave scene and just tried to get involved in that. And then in the year 2000, I had myself quite a few addictions at this stage, and I was in a bit of a pickle. And I just packed a bag and sodded off to Ibiza, because it seemed like a really right thing to do at the time. It was an escape, you know. So I went over to Ibiza and I lived there for 4 years. Again, street pharmacy, used to sell loads of E's and just partied my way around Ibiza for 4 years, essentially. And then at some point, I found that I had got myself a wee drug debt, essentially. And it was offered to me a very good proposition that I could clear my drug debt if I wanted to start trafficking some drugs. This was across Europe at the time. And I thought this sounded like a great idea, because I was a right numpty. So I started doing that for about a year, and I was just traveling across Europe, transporting drugs across Europe, lots of different trips. And actually, I really enjoyed myself doing that. It was a sense of freedom. I paid off my drug debt. I earned some money, and I got to travel all over the place. And after about a year, they came to me and said, "Do you fancy doing an international trip?" And I went, "Yeah, that sounds great. Why not?" And well, that was the start of a whole different scenario, essentially. So I got to Mexico, and basically I got stopped in Mexico City in the airport there with 20 kilos of cocaine in a suitcase. And it was me and my boyfriend at the time. And got myself a wee 10-year sentence in Mexico, which was a real shock to the system, to say the least, you know. So I ended up serving a 4-year sentence in a Mexican prison. And then I came back to Holloway. I got repatriated to Holloway, the repatriation team. And the first day that I got to Holloway, I'd spent a long time in Mexico, very bored. When I first got to Mexico, to the prison, there was no books at all. And over the course of 4 years there, I managed to fill up a whole room full of English books, which I'd managed to get donated from people in Mexico City and the embassy and stuff like that. But there was nothing to do, you know. So when I got back to Holloway, the first thing I did was I went down to the library. I went down to the education centre and spoke to a lovely guy, lovely older guy that was working in the education centre. And I said, "What can I do? I really want to do something interesting. Can you help me?" And he went, "How about doing an open university course?" And I thought, God, no, university sounds terrifying. And he was like, no, this first course is an access course. They'll teach you how to study, you know. So so I signed up and I started doing an access course, and I just fell in love. I just absolutely fell in love with studying. I loved it. It was what I was supposed to be doing. So I spent the next 3 years of my prison sentence studying and studying and studying some more and getting the first part of my degree. And I found a job teaching kids at risk of offending in a college down in Kent. I moved to an open prison. I should say I was pregnant during all of this as well. Just throw that in there. Conjugal visits in Mexico. So I had my child. I was in an open prison. I was working really hard. I was studying. I started doing a teaching degree on top of my other degree, my Open University degree, and got out of prison. Had more children, got my master's degree, and then went into my PhD, essentially. So it's been a really long, meandering journey to get where I am. But yeah, I found about 3 years ago, I was in a proper pickle, because all the stuff that had crept up on me throughout the years, all the traumas, all the relational trauma, the little bits, death by 1,000 cuts, you know, all the little things that had happened just overloaded me, essentially. And I found myself with a really severe alcohol problem. And it was the first week of COVID, I think. And I just said, enough, I can't do this anymore. I need to stop. And I'd already been through, I tried some smart therapy, I tried normal therapy, and it just seemed pointless telling my problems to someone. So I started running and meditating, and I've never touched a drop since. I just managed to work through my traumas, essentially. And yeah, to cut a very long story short, I think that's essentially essentially it.
So thank you very, very, very much for sharing, Lucy. Incredible story from you've told. I've got many, many, many questions I've got to ask, which I will which I will save for ongoing. The one thing you haven't said is, what's your PhD in? What's
criminology? Oh, so yeah, so I'm studying, my research is about spatio-hauntology and emotional residue.
Mm-hmm.
So it's essentially the study of how spaces affect us and come back to haunt us. So it looks at precisely how we carry the experience of prison with us. What is it about prison that haunts us? What was it about being in that space with all these other women that are traumatized and haunted by their past experiences, in a place that is haunted and traumatized by all the past experiences that it's experienced? And then we go in there and spend time in there and come out and basically carry this trauma out into the community, with all this accumulated trauma and vicarious trauma, as well as our own trauma. And then, yeah, we're out into society, spreading that love around to everyone else. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, there's a book in it somewhere, I think.
So yeah, amazing. Thank you very, very much. So yeah, with that being your immaculately timed 15-minute 10 to 15-minute opening gambit, I think we can now move on to Neil. So Neil's story is different. We could almost say same, but different, but mainly different, I would say. Neil, thank you very much for joining. So those of you who do not know Neil Woods, former undercover police officer, which you are about to hear about, and also board member of LEAP, which has had various acronyms, but currently is Law Enforcement Action Partnership. I believe a collection of current and former enforcement officers who largely campaign against prohibition and the war on drugs. So Neil, yeah, thank you very, very much for joining. And as ever, a friend of street drugs, it's certainly not the first time you have shared your wisdom and stories with us. So yeah, Neil, thank you very much in advance. And yeah, please now tell us your story.
Thank you, James. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak on a street drugs event again. Lucy, that was really fascinating. I could probably talk to you all day, and I'm sure we will do at some point if we meet at some point in the future. Particularly interested in your studies and the impact of trauma, because again, I could talk about prisons and the impact of prisons all day, but that's not what I've been invited to do. So I'll go back to some my undercover days, and as probably many of you know, I essentially used to catch drug dealers for a living, but that meant that I would go into various inner city areas around the UK and sort of embed myself into the street drug dealing community and try and infiltrate organised crime at that point. The first time I bought heroin from a child was in Leicester in 2001. And that was really unusual and actually quite shocking back then. But the reason I raise that is that it's not shocking now. We have become almost numb and immune to children being exploited to deal heroin in the UK. There are, in fact, 50,000 children currently on the front line dealing heroin and crack cocaine in the UK. 50,000. Now, that's extraordinary. And that's not happening in any other European country, well, apart from Sweden. So for those of you around the world, just to give some context of how shocking that is. But the reason I start with that is because it wasn't always that way. The first time I came across that was in 2001. But there's a good reason why it's happening more now. And that's, well, partly my fault. What I used to do is I would travel to a particular area, particular in a city, and I would befriend the most vulnerable people. And the reason I would seek out the most vulnerable people is because vulnerable people are easier to manipulate. And if that sounds ruthless, well, of course it's ruthless. This is covert drugs policing. It's ruthless. Undercover policing is ruthless. And so I would spend time emotionally manipulating really the most vulnerable people in our society, people who are living without homes or living in squats or on the edge of that sort of street community. And they were also very useful, these vulnerable people, because they always knew the most drug dealers, and many of them used to be able to introduce me further up the chain to the sort of regional controllers. Those were my main targets, really. The people who are actually functioning members of organised crime rather than the vulnerable, manipulated people. And, you know, this took me to meet all sorts of characters. I remember in Nottinghamshire, it took me 4.5 months to get an introduction to this particular lieutenant of the Bestwood cartel, rather infamous gang. And he turned up, the first time to meet me, he turned up with his 12-year-old son sat next to him in the car. And this 12-year-old son of his, he had dressed in exactly the same outfit. They were wearing exactly the same two-piece tracksuit, the same gold chain, the same tracksuits and the same shaved head. He was like his son was a mini me. And he'd obviously taken him out for the day to show him how, you know, it's that take your child to work day. He was showing his kid the ropes about what you know, what you do when you grow up. And what that meant for me was that this gangster basically interrogated me with a knife pressed into my groin. And that's really uncomfortable. In fact, it's really off-putting when you're trying to have a conversation with somebody. When you're trying to maintain a lie, it's quite unsettling. But he did this with his keen-eyed 12-year-old son looking on, as to, you know, this is how you grow up and behave. So that was I think 2004. So 3 years after the first time I bought heroin from a child, and we've got this child being taught how to be a baby gangster. And so it went on. In that operation, actually, I gave up undercover work for a short while, because at the end of it, the vulnerable person that I'd been manipulating, who had got me that introduction to that rather crazy gangster with his son, the person who got me the introduction I'd also got evidence against. So at the end of the operation, after the end of the 7-month operation, he was also arrested. And he ended up being on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch, when he was arrested, because he thought I was his one friend in the world, the one person that he could talk to. And I had spent a lot of time talking with him. You know, he'd opened up about his childhood traumas. The reason that he was self-medicating with heroin, it became clear to me, was because he'd had an abusive, violent relationship from his father. And, you know, I'd been doing undercover work for about 10 years by this point. And it had become very clear to me that all of the vulnerable people that I was manipulating had similar stories. They were all self-medicating for some kind of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect. A large number of them had alcoholic parents in particular. That was a very common feature. But back to the point, he became suicidal. And so that was too much for me emotionally for a while. And I gave up undercover work for a while. But then I was myself manipulated back into the work, because there was a gang called the Burger Bar Boys who had taken over the heroin and crack cocaine market in a town called Northampton. And in the UK, it is the duty of an undercover operative to study the intelligence for which the basis of the operation is proposed. So it's actually, there is a legal responsibility for the undercover operative to be certain themselves that there is justification for the operation. And so I studied the intelligence, and it was extraordinary. This gang, the Burger Bar Boys, which I'm always told is a really very British name for a gang. So I don't know what you Americans think, but it's a really stupid name, isn't it? But the Burger Bar Boys, they were using sexual violence as part of their reputation building. They were doing the normal kind of gangster stuff, you know, kidnappings, maimings, that kind of thing. But the sexual violence really stood out in the intelligence. But they were also, one of them was also implicated in 7 separate murders in Birmingham. And he was also the person who had supplied 2 machine guns for the infamous murder of 2 young women called Letitia Shakespeare and Charmaine Harris, just a few months before this operation. So all of that meant that I was under pressure to carry on doing the work, because 2 other undercover operatives had tried to get close to that gang and they'd not managed to. So I went back into it, and I manipulated some more vulnerable people, and I spent weeks and weeks sort of building a legend of somebody who was trading in stolen property. So I made friends with anyone who was dealing in the stolen property. I went and spent a lot of time shoplifting, which was good fun, certainly a distraction, and found that actually you can always sell baby clothes and children's clothes. There's always a big market for that because they grow up so quick, don't they? So that's, anyway, that was something I learned. But eventually I got introduced to the Burger Bar Boys, and they were terrifying, I have to say. From every single day in their company, I felt physically unsafe, literally every day. So I heard Lucy mention the death of 1,000 cuts, and a lot of my mental health damage has come from those multiple layered traumas and fear on top of fear. And there's so many moments in that operation that was, because I think I was already in the middle of trauma when I went into that operation, so it just layered and layered. But the first time I was introduced to them, I was taken to this snooker club where they were holding court, and I was directed into the gents' toilets. And when I went in, there was a terrified guy who was introducing me, and my main guy came into the toilets wearing this hood, came into the cubicle, stood in the toilet, shut the door and looked over the top and said, "What's this?" And the moment he said that, 4 more hooded figures came in and they started circling me slowly. And every so often, one of them would headbutt me on the side of the head, on the ear, or one of them would push me and punch me in the ribs. And this was happening all the time I was being interrogated by the guy looking down on me. And the pain was getting worse, and it went on and on and on. And obviously I knew the reputation of these people. It was dawning on me that I wasn't walking out of there in one piece. And I knew what they were capable of. And just as the moment where I'm sort of accepting some extreme violence, then it stopped. And he said, "All right then, what do you want?" And I rather timidly said, "I'll have 1 and 1, please." And I gave him my 40 quid, and he gave me a 0.4 of heroin, a 0.4 of crack. And that was the most important day of the operation, really, because we exchanged phone numbers, and we began the process of buying from them regularly, increasing the amounts and trading some stolen property with them. But essentially I was gathering evidence of conspiracy against them, but also all of their backup team. So after 7 months, I'd got evidence against 96 people, the 6 main gangsters, plus 90 of their support staff, all of the sex workers that were working for them, runners, people who were stashing. It's an extraordinary network. But I was thinking that now by this point, I'd taken quite a dislike to this group. I have to be honest. They were not my favorite people in the world. So I was quite pleased the idea I was going to be able to catch them. Yeah. And 90 other people, I thought, this is ridiculous. I thought, we're going to shut down the drug supply completely in this town. There were hundreds of police brought in from the counties all surrounding that area. It was an enormous operation. But when the dust had settled, the intel officer, who was tasked with keeping his ear to the ground as to the impact of the operation, spoke to me, and he says, "Yep, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 96 people, 7 months of work, being convinced I was going to die on multiple occasions for the sake of interrupting the drug supply for 2 hours." Now, I don't know for certain that it's the Burger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, who took up that opportunity that had been created for them. But you can sort of picture the scene, can't you? Rival gangs sat round, one of them comes in and says, "Put the call in, boys. We're going to make a fortune. Guess what the cops have done for us? They've only gone and arrested the Burger Bar Boys. Whoopie-doo." And, you know, I had to face up to all of the doubts I'd been building on for years and years, and finally give in to them that this is ridiculous. This is the most futile, horrendous work that I'm doing, because we're really, and it dawned on me, you know, us cops, we're really good at this. We're really good at catching drug dealers. And if we had twice the resources, we could catch twice as many. But that's the problem, because at that level, or a higher level, or a lower level, or any level around the world, regional, international, police never reduce the size of the market. So all you do is constantly create opportunities for somebody else, constantly. And the problem is that more often than not increases violence in that marketplace. First time I did that undercover work, there was no threat of violence because my presence wasn't acknowledged in that market. The thing that causes violence in the market is the use of undercover cops, and even more so, the use of police informants, because all of the threat and violence within those marketplaces is to try and protect against grassers. It's to intimidate people so you're not the person grassed up. And why wouldn't you do that? You've got to protect yourself. But worse than that is that it also leads to corruption. Now, I've only got a minute and a half or so, but I'll briefly try and squeeze this in. During that Nottinghamshire investigation, I was introduced to a new cop who was my backup, and I took great exception to him. I didn't trust him at all. Just on a handshake, his body language freaked me out. So I got him excluded from that operation. I didn't think more of it, but he didn't basically, it was before he was in the briefing, he didn't know anything about what was going on. A year later, when the Bestwood cartel were brought down, it turned out that cop I'd taken an exception to was an employee of Colin Gunn, the gangster who ran that cartel. And he wasn't corrupted whilst he was in the police. He was paid to join the police. And he'd been in the police for 7 years by the time I met him. He was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. Now, it's not just the vast wealth in the illicit drug markets. The international value in the illicit drug markets is actually bigger than the textile business. We're all wearing textiles, right? So that's the scale of it. It's not just the value that is causing this corruption, it's also the mechanism of policing those markets. Because what informants are really good at, and often at the instruction of organised crime, is to get rid of the competition. What police are really good at is thinning out the competition for the more successful players. And this causes monopolies, or it causes cooperatives. Monopolies and cooperatives have a bigger disposable income than lots of small freelancers. If you have in your power more disposable income, it is always reinvested into corruption. Always, always. There's many examples of how this happens. Mexican cartels have a bigger GDP than most West African countries. Those cartels are using that money to corrupt those West African countries. So we now have narco states in West Africa or in Honduras, to some degree in Venezuela. But that's not just caused by the wealth. It's caused by prohibition. It's caused by the act of trying to police prohibition. Because at every level, we thin out the competition. We are, by trying to police drugs in a prohibition regime, we are sharpening the sword of organised crime. We have been sharpening the sword of organised crime for decades. And so I suppose that's the point I'll leave on, because I've just gone over 15 minutes.
Thank you very, very much. Absolutely perfect timing again. And thanks again very, very much for sharing your story. Yeah, every time I hear it or read it, there's always new extra details and aspects to that. So thank you very, very much again. Lots and lots which I will return to probe on later. I think we've had a number of really encouraging comments, to keep the comments coming. We've had a couple of questions too, which I will come back to later. I think now we'll actually pick up some of the themes from your gambit, Neil, and pose those as questions to Lucy. Now, so I was wondering, there was some themes of, lots of the kind of intimidation and manipulation within the particular drug worlds that Neil was policing at the time. Some of those relating more or less to the dealers and to the presence of police and undercovers and informants. So Lisa, I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit more about how that related to the drug scene you found yourself in Ibiza. Did you find it was, very free and easy sort of scene, or was it one of manipulation and intimidation? When you were asked to pay this debt, did it feel more an opportunity or something where there was less choice for you, as they kind of upped the ante from European excursions to Mexico? So I'm just wondering how that all was, and how that drug world which you were in, kind of in parallel at the same time as Neil was involved in different. Just wondering how that relates, and anything you can say about the drug worlds that you were involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was very free and easy actually in Ibiza. I have to say, it was everyone was it was a very relaxed drug scene. So we're going back to 2000 to 2004 here, you know. I mean, it's changed. I've still got lots of friends over there, and it's changed massively now. I mean, the clampdown has been incredible. Whereas back then, actually, it was very easy going. And when it came to me having that drug debt, and it was an offer, it was definitely an offer, and which when I took up, yeah, wholeheartedly. So there's a whole branch of sociology called edge work, and edge work is about how you find yourself in situations, how you gravitate towards situations which are dangerous, situations which give you a buzz, you know, whether it's skydiving, drug dealing, anything at all that, you know, you get that adrenaline buzz from. And that was just me my entire youth. Anything at all I got a buzz from. And to gravitate from simple selling of, you know, I never sold huge amounts, don't get me wrong. It was always just enough to keep my rent paid, keep myself ticking over, and keep my cocaine habit flowing nicely, you know. It was all about keeping me okay as a survival strategy, I suppose. But yeah, for the edge work, when I was offered the chance to transport stuff, I leapt at it. I wanted to do that because it was an opportunity to travel. It was an opportunity to do something differently. It was bigger money once I paid off my debt. So it was all very free and easy back then. Although I will say there was quite a large Scouse contingent just coming in at the time, which was getting a little bit more dodgy, and it was getting a little bit more dangerous. And I think I probably got out. I was probably hoiked out at exactly the right time, because I'm not sure how much longer that could have continued for me. I see the things now with county lines, Neil, you know, and the state of the drug situation in the UK was very different for me back then. I think, I mean, I'm from Cornwall. I was a very small time drug dealer. I sold to people in town. You know, I was never shifting kilos or anything like that, but I still had the undercovers on me many, many times. My house was busted, my flat was busted 10, 12 times by the police, constantly getting told, oh, that guy over there's an undercover. Yeah, they never actually caught anything in my house at all. I'd always managed to get rid of it before, or get a heads up, or it went out the window, or something happened where I wasn't quite caught. But they were there. They were omnipresent, the undercovers and the police in Cornwall. Devon and Cornwall police had a horrendous reputation for the control of drugs and the harassment of people for using and selling. So I think I wouldn't want to be in that situation, especially as a single female, as I was then as well. You know, I wouldn't want to be in that situation now. It's a very, very different landscape that we find ourselves in now than it was back then in the late 90s. Very different and much more dangerous now as well. I think I was kidnapped once, but yeah, that's a whole different story. But yeah, very, very briefly kidnapped looking for drugs, but it wasn't that level of danger and violence that there is now. It's kind of a genteel scene in a way, I suppose, you know. But yeah, different scenario from Neil's, I suppose. It's Cornwall as well. It's very rural. So I think I was much safer then than I would be now. It's not something I'd even consider now as a young person, you know.
Interesting, thank you very much. Before I move back, I've got a couple of questions on your response of things that interested me. Said this though, one thing was you said it was all very free and easy, and Ibiza, and just seemed like this fantastic opportunity to travel and get paid for it.
Yeah.
Once you got to Mexico, did things get a bit more scary, or was it still quite chill out there?
No, well, it was just we were supposed to be going to Costa Rica, so we had a holiday in Costa Rica, picked up the drugs in Costa Rica, and it was supposed to be very well hidden. This is a route that had been done many times before. I was told, you'll be fine, it's been done, you know, there's 20 kilos, they're going to hide it well. And then we got to Costa Rica at the towards the end of the holiday. They came to the hotel room, and it was just briefcase after briefcase after briefcase full of coke. I mean, we looked at it, there was no way we were going to be able to get that back through customs. I didn't even know what they were thinking. But at that point, it was literally guns to heads. You are taking this back. I mean, okay, cool. I'm not going to argue, you know. So we got through Costa Rica airport. They were paid off in Costa Rica airport. We landed in Mexico. We had a flight change in Mexico. And as soon as we landed in Mexico, almost as soon as we landed, I could see enforcement agents everywhere. And I just knew, we knew straight away, that's for us, we're screwed here. And of course, as soon as we tried to board the plane, they came down on us. It was a very different scenario in Mexico. There was nothing free and easy about Mexico at all. I mean, Mexico prison was, yeah, a whole different ball game as well. It's, yeah, a lovely place for a holiday. I don't recommend it for a prison stay in the slightest.
Noted. Yeah, I'm sure we'll get onto more of that as well. And so another just bit, something that piqued my curiosity. Have you ever worked out whether, you know, it sounds like when you got there, the really obvious suitcases, clearly, I guess someone had passed word from Costa Rica onto Mexico about your arrival. Have you worked out whether that was kind of incompetence or malice that got you done there?
Incompetence for sure. So quite often what they did was they'd send through someone with a kilo to distract, you know, so that person with the kilo got nicked where the people coming through with the big amounts didn't. And I think it was just sheer incompetence. I don't think they'd taken into account that we had a change in Mexico. I think for some reason, they thought we were on a plane from Costa Rica, we'd be heading back, and that was that. But of course, as soon as Mexico is notorious for their airports and their drug policies, you know. So, and then of course, when we were arrested with 20 kilos and photographed with 20 kilos, but we only ever got charged for 17. When you're talking about corruption, Neil, there's the mystery of the 3 missing kilos there somewhere, you know. So, yeah, I mean, the police, obviously, they consider that to be a good day at work if they can go home with an extra 3 kilos. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'll move back to Neil now. I should say as well, both Neil and Lucy, if you have points to follow up each other's points, please do butt in and make those points. Neil, if you've got anything you'd like to respond to that, please do. But also, I'd like to ask you as well. So, you know, Lucy said she kind of got on this with the content, you know, talk about the content of edge work, finding exciting stuff to do, kind of instead of like skydiving, ended up being drugs, or maybe as well as even. But and for Neil, I've wondered, the people who you, I guess, in inverted commas, worked with during your undercover days, were you working with people who had got into that particular world, you know, heroin and crack using and dealing in the Midlands? Were people there through excitement or through lack of choice, do you think, for the particular drug selling world that you became enmeshed in?
Well, I mean, most of the work I did was the problematic heroin and crack cocaine markets. And then and now they are really a very different beast to the broader sort of adult use drug markets, I think, even powder cocaine markets and certainly MDMA markets. And I know it has changed, but even now, I would suspect that most people, anyone out there listening to this, the vast majority of people who will get a pill to go clubbing with or a pill before their festival are not going to come across any particular problems in that market. So I think there is a big separation. And so the people, I suppose, the heroin and crack cocaine gangs, no, they were in it for money. Most of the user dealers were in it because they had no choice. They were traumatized people dealing with emotional trauma in the best way that they could through the use of heroin, building up a debt, and then exploited by organized crime to sell more and more. That's the curse of the user dealer. They're exploited because they don't have any choice, because they're not looked after by the state, essentially. And that's what organized crime love. Organized crime always love vulnerable people to exploit, and they always will. But having said that, I met plenty of other people that were outside that market, and I recognize completely what Lucy said. You know, the living on the edge. A lot of the people, that's what they enjoyed, and there's sort of my own parallel, I suppose, because I was an awful uniformed police officer. I just wasn't very good at it, basically, and I struggled with the confrontation. I couldn't be doing with the environment. But as soon as I was on my own working undercover, I'm more of a loner. I took to this. It really suited my personality for a big collection of reasons, really. But one of those reasons was much what Lucy said. I loved the thrill. And in the first few times I thought I was going to die, Like I think the first time was someone put a samurai sword to my throat and I thought I had a good relationship with him. He was a heroin dealer. Anyway, I got my way through that, managed to buy some heroin, walked away from that address, and then someone tried to rob me at knife point for the heroin I'd just bought. And that was just within minutes of each other. So I had all of these things happening, but I remember when I was running away from the guy with the knife, and he was saying, no, hang on, just come here a minute. I'm like I was going to stop and come here a minute. But when I went back to the debrief and spending time with the cops, I really enjoyed that buzz. I was shaking from the post-adrenaline thing, but I wasn't walking away from undercover work because of that, because I was enjoying that sort of edge behavior. I was thriving on it even. So I recognized something there. And I also recognized that many of the people who were just dealing, larger quantities of pills or powdered coke, a lot of those people were in similar personalities even, perhaps.
I think that's it's quite a salient point. I always say, I think for years I had a void, that there was just something, felt like there was something missing. I couldn't get to grips with what it was. I didn't know what it was. I tried to fill it with drugs and partying and edge work, trying to fill that void with anything at all. And I think most of the people I've met on the journey have been the same. There's a reason there, whether it's trauma, whether it's childhood experiences, it's just there's something missing, and you fill it with anything you can, anything that gives you a buzz, anything that gets you through the night, so to speak. So I mean, there's a reason why people gravitate towards these circles, very much so. No one wakes up at school when they're 16 or 17 and goes, oh, I'm going to drop everything and go and become addicted to drugs. Or it's not a rational choice that's made. It's something that happens because of circumstances. So I think the criminal justice system is starting to take this into account now, but it hasn't very much before. That actually there are reasons why people get into the issues they do. There are reasons why people go down the pathways they go down. It's not just criminality.
Awesome, thank you for that. That actually kind of leads on to the next line of questioning that I was going to move. And there's one question from the chat I can't quite find at this moment, but it's relating to time in prison. Obviously, for any question of this, feel free to rebut and say you don't want to answer. Move on. But so a couple of things. So the question was about how you were treated by other prisoners as an overseas drug trafficker, and secondly, what something I'd like to ask accompanied is what were most women in a Mexican jail in for? Basically, were they mostly related to drugs? I don't know if you've read the really good book Drug Mules by Jennifer Fleetwood.
Nope.
She was been a previous guest on this. I'll say a bit more about this book, and everyone in the audience who is interested should buy this book because it's excellent. So when Jenny was also at Edinburgh University, and I believe possibly your PhD student was her supervisor, was her dissertation supervisor, Angus Bancroft was, and so she was teaching English in Ecuador over the summer, and then saw an advert for visiting English language speaking women in prison, and then did a dissertation on it and a PhD on it, and postdoctoral studies as well, and written this amazing book. But anyway, long story short, a lot of the women who were in prison in Quito in Ecuador were in for drug trafficking offences. And so I'm wondering if it was similar, the prison environment was similar. I mean, obviously I can't imagine it was fun, but I just wonder how you were treated by other inmates, especially with your particular status as your type of prisoner.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've not read her book, but I've read her thesis. So yeah, really, really interesting stuff. Yeah, I won't watch the series Orange is the New Black because I thought it was going to be really good. And the first episode I watched, a woman walks into prison as a new prisoner, and they attack her. She gets attacked on her first day in prison. Everyone's being all violent. And I have to say, I have never encountered that. I was in 3 different prisons in Mexico. I was in 2 different prisons in the UK. I've never encountered that kind of attitude from women. I've only ever encountered welcoming, support. Women have always been really, really lovely. and I really cherished that. I think that's one of the reasons I became a raging feminist. I think is to counter these ideas of women being, you know, manipulative and violent. And I mean, when I got to Mexico, it was they take you into something called ingreso, and it's a very small area of the prison, and it's like the entrance cells. And I was put in a cell with 9 other women. It was 1 bunk bed, so 2 beds. And there were 9 other women. So the oldest person in the cell, or whoever been in the longest, took the top bunk, then the second bunk, and then everyone else just kind of curled up on the floor in whatever little spaces they could. And when I got into that cell, they gave me a blanket, they gave me some food. I was, you know, and I could rubbish Spanish at that point, you know. So they were just trying to talk to me and find out what I was in for and how I was. And I was just really well supported. They were lovely. Walking around, everyone was asking for cigarettes. It probably helped that I had quite a few packets of cigarettes, so I was giving them out left, right, and centre. So, but yeah, I mean, the women were lovely. And I found actually in every single prison I've been in, the first attitude is welcoming and support. You have to make women dislike you. You have to give them a reason for them to dislike you, for women to turn on you in a prison situation. If you go in there with a bad attitude, then absolutely you will get a bad attitude back. But it's very much a mirrored situation. So yeah, I found the prisons, I mean, don't get me wrong, the prison conditions for men are better than the prison conditions for women. So the men are all, there's quite a lot of partying goes on in the men's prisons, and they just tend to kick back and do their sentences. Whereas the women's prisons I found were a site of trauma. The women were very traumatized, whether they'd been split up from their children, their families. They were coming in from situations where they'd been beaten by their spouses or been raped, or there was just trauma. It was just wading through trauma. That was very difficult. It was a nice relief to go over to the men's side once a week and just get a break from it, because it was just, yeah, it was quite safe over in the men's side. Most of the women, why were they in there? Poverty would be my main answer to that. Absolutely poverty. They were street, there was lots of street kids. So only young, say 18, 19 years old, raised on the street, little street rats, you know, raised in the sewers of Mexico City, couldn't read or write, got caught shoplifting 2 or 3 times, banged up. Quite a few women that killed their husbands. And when you heard the stories, you were like, right on. Absolutely, I would have done that too. Lots of theft and lots of fraud, I think. But very few traffickers in Mexico City, very few traffickers. I think most traffickers are sensible enough not to go through Mexico City in the airport. But there was a South African and a French woman as well, but not very many traffickers at all. So, but mainly I would say the majority of women that were in there because of men, because of being, you know, associated with men, married to men. It was all to do with, it's a very patriarchal society as well. So the women quite often, if their husbands were arrested, they were arrested too, sentenced to the same sentence. That's that.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a question from Neil, but there's one question from the chat which does relate very closely to what you've been saying. This is from Rebecca Tidy in the chat. It says, I wonder, did motherhood change your attitude towards the drug industry at all? It sometimes feels as though media representations of women who traffic drugs are really inaccurate, whereby the mother is viewed as a selfish person, yet the reality is sometimes that mothers feel this is the least bad option to provide for their child and survive.
Interesting. I can only answer from my own background. I only had children after I trafficked. I would not set a foot wrong. Now I've got children. I wouldn't do that. I can understand people having different situations, you know, and being so poor, essentially, that they have to do something like that, and being given the opportunity or manipulated into the opportunity to traffic. Motherhood's changed me in many, many ways for the better, but it's not something I would do now. Has it changed my opinion on drugs? No, I think drugs have their place. 100% drugs have their place. I don't do them now, apart from psychedelics. Just because I'm aged out. I think I've got too old, I can't handle it. But yeah, I don't think motherhood's changed my opinion on drugs particularly, but I understand completely why some women would do that.
Noted, and thank you very much. So we'll move back to Neil now. I think I'll keep on the women's role question. Just wondering, you know, how much when you of the drugs world that you were spying on and integrating yourself in, how much of that was a man's world at the time? What were the roles of women then? And, you know, were women involved more through choice or through lack of choice in that world at that time?
Oh, that's a good question. It was definitely a male-dominated world. Particularly the heroin and crack cocaine market is very aggressive, masculine. The violence is up front. But I mean, I've come across many women dealers, but that most of them were involved because of the, like Lucy's just said, because of the man. So I recognise that. And I remember one actually. It was a large-scale amphetamine dealer who I was getting close to by as part of a wider operation, and he wasn't always in, so I was quite often dealing with his girlfriend. Now, this is a bizarre situation because I was finding that his girlfriend was really coming on to me. Now, I knew that in their relationship, she was being physically abused by him, and she was being roped into it because she was being very much controlled. And I remember going back to the safe location and explaining what was happening with my colleagues and all of my male colleagues. I was stunned because they said, "Well, go for it. You'll get much more information out of her if you're involved with her." And this was the response from my colleagues, which I found pretty disturbing, to be honest, because the idea of actually forming a relationship with someone like that, and yet she doesn't know who I really am, is morally repugnant. But I just made that point just because it's a big issue from undercover policing about what the spy cops did. And I suppose, although there wasn't the same kind of infiltration tactics for the kind of work that I did, you still had that sort of male-dominated, almost misogynistic structures around the work that I was doing. So I suppose that sort of reflects the situation for many of the women that I came across were being either manipulated or they were in an abusive relationship with the male making them do it. You also had the males from the other side, the policing side, potentially preying on them in that same situation. So I always found that was it's a double-edged sword, I think, of the way that some of them found themselves. And when women had been caught, they were always sentenced really harshly as well. And all the time that I've been doing that work, they were disproportionately sentenced as well, I would have said, in terms of their planning role and involvement. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, James. I've rambled a bit. Sorry.
It was a very, very on-topic ramble. I think I gave it deliberately open-ended, and he responded perfectly. So thank you for that. I think I've got a few questions here which kind of relate to people's curiosity about your kind of operational world as an undercover. I think they're mostly kind of quite quick ones, so I'll kind of chuck these in. So one is from Lucky David. Throughout your time in undercover work,
I've lost you, James. You've frozen.
That's normally me that does that.
Yeah, I don't think he's anywhere difficult either, you know. Okay, well, I mean, I can maybe carry on while he's frozen. Sam Dunn, Lucy, wants to know about the modules you did with the OU.
Mm-hmm. The access course. So the access course it's an entry into studying essentially, and what it does, instead of your normal 30-point module, it's a wee 10-pointer, and what it does is it teaches you how to write to university standard. So it teaches you how to write essays, it teaches you how to communicate in an academic manner essentially. And yeah, it was arts, past and present was what it was called. And I had to analyze artworks and the humanities and a bit of sociology in there as well. It's a bit of a mixture of everything to give you a taster of academia. And I fell in love with it, completely fell in love with it. It was wonderful. I remember they issued me with a prison laptop, which was just, I mean, I thought I was the dog's bollocks with the laptop.
That's great.
Yeah, back in the day, and it was, you know, and I used to sit in my room, and I was pregnant at the time, and I was getting quite heavily pregnant, and I used to sit there writing essays with my laptop on my lap, blasting Pachelbel's Canon into my baby whilst writing essays. And it was just, it's not such an image you associate with prison, you know.
Not at all, no.
But you know, it was just wonderful. It released my inner academic and just gave me a whole new outlook on life. It partly towards filling the void, you know. Yeah.
I mean, there are quite a lot of people asking about your experience in prison and papers that you've published, Lucy.
Oh, not yet. Give me a chance. I'm I'm only a first year PhD student, so I'm finding my feet at the moment. It's they will come. Otherwise I'll get a butt kicking from my supervisors. They will come.
Always. Yeah. I'll come back to you then, James.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, sorry, my internet just died and then came back again. So apologies for my drop off then. So I don't know how much was asked in my absence. Neil, had I disappeared before or after asking you whether you ever ended up having to use drugs while an undercover?
No, I didn't hear that, but I can certainly ask that if you like. I didn't have to very often, thankfully, because it was a most uncomfortable thing to not be able to concentrate properly when you're feeling vulnerable. It's not very helpful. So I used to hate it, and I used to have to occasionally use cannabis when I was working undercover. It's awful. But I suppose the one time where I really potentially got myself into some trouble is I'd made a really, really stupid mistake on this operation, because I'd made myself out to be a connoisseur of amphetamine, which I'm clearly not. But it was something to talk about. And the main target of this operation, who was a big antique burglar, major car thief, and big cocaine dealer, came up to me one day and said, "Hey, you, I've got a present for you." And he held up this little Sealy bag with this rather toxic looking goo in it. And it smelled so strong. It smelled like the urine from a glue sniffing cat. If any of you recognize that really toxic base amphetamine smell. Anyway, I had a momentary reticence flash across my face. I must have done, because a momentary suspicion went across his face. And I thought, I have got to pour water on that fire of suspicion immediately. So I enthusiastically scooped some of this base amphetamine into my mouth. And then he looked at me and said, "You'll need more than that with your tolerance." So I thought, oh God. So I had some more. I could almost feel the mouth ulcers forming in my mouth and that warm glow in my stomach. And in no time at all, I was completely out of it. It was horrendous. I knew enough about it. I wasn't going to overdose or anything. You need a lot of amphetamine to overdose, but it was way beyond comfortable. And I remember being driven home and thinking, I've got 8 cans of lager in the fridge. That'll take the edge off. 8 cans. I remember being at home and finishing the 8th can and feeling no difference at all. I didn't sleep properly for 3 nights. That's how strong it was. Mind you, my house has never been so tidy.
I was going to ask that. How clean was your house?
Yeah.
I could smell, when you said it, I could smell the base amphetamine when you said that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for sharing that, Neil. Such anecdotes always remind me of one of the first research interviews I did with someone who was injected a lot of amphetamine. He told me he used to inject half an ounce a day. He'd 4 times a day, he'd put a whole 3.5 grams into a barrel and inject. But he ran a cleaning company, and I can imagine it was a very, very, very good cleaning company. Anyway, back to you, Lucy, and I think we can, there's another question which relates to Neil's response there is, were there many drugs in a Mexican jail? I guess with your lifestyle at the time, one might think you would have, any opportunity, or perhaps the whole getting banged up might have been quite chastening. You'd have thought no more of that. So yeah, I just wondered if you can say a bit more about what your lifestyle was like in the Mexican jail, whether there were drugs in the women's side, whether there were drugs in your weekly visits to the men's side.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's it's quite quite a horrendous situation, I suppose. So when I first went in, those first few weeks in Ingresso, I was in cocaine withdrawals, alcohol withdrawals. I was in a right pickle, essentially. And I think I had 3 months, no, up to 6 months, I think, of just not touching a single thing. It was just, you know, I was in the women's side. There was nothing I could do about it. There were no drugs. And there might have been drugs, but I wasn't looking for them. I was just quite happy. I was exercising. I was trying to eat where I could, and I was just trying to get my head around what was going on, essentially. And then they moved us. They shut down the prison that we were in, which was old and really tatty. It was attached to the men's side in the north of the city, and they moved us to this big high security prison called Santa Marta Acatitla in Mexico City, and it was just horrendous. It's a big concrete monstrosity with big, long, dark corridors of concrete, and everywhere you look it's like the panopticon. You've got a central tower in the middle, and all the wings come out from it, and you're watched at all points, and it was just horrendous. And my mental health took a severe downturn in this place. And one of the girls said to me once, "Oh, we're going to go and do some drugs," and I was like, "Count me in." And I think I spent the next 2 years just doing loads of crack cocaine, just because that was all there was to do. Yeah, it was I got myself in a real pickle with it, you know. And but it passed the time. It really did pass the time. So, well, mostly anyway. But and then I managed to straighten myself out up to a point. We'd go over to the men's side on the weekends, and there'd be, so my partner, he was in dormitory 2, which was a protection dorm. So it was all the mafia bosses and all the undercover police who had been nicked, and all of the lawyers, the mafia lawyers and ex-policemen. So, you know, quite a well-established, good money in there. Everyone was, you know, it was run by the mafia essentially. And my other half had got himself a wee job doing what they called the S8 for the mafia, which is you stand at one side of the dorm and you just shout the S8 if the cops or the guards start coming in that direction, a heads up essentially. So we found ourselves friends with the mafia. So I'd go over there, we'd have conjugal visits. They'd take you over on a Saturday, you come back late on the Sunday night, and you had a little room, and we went over there and they were giving us tons of free cocaine and vodka, and we were having little parties in our room. It was great fun. Yeah, I know. And we had access to the mafia fridge where they had cheese and stuff. Yeah, I tell you, there's a book in it somewhere. But you know, that kind of easygoing party lifestyle in Dorm 2 was quite normal. It was a completely different scenario, because then you came back into the women's side, and again, you had addiction. It was just, there was no cocaine in the women's side, none at all. You know, they smoked a bit of weed, but there was no cocaine. It was all crack. Yeah, a very different vibe, you know, and because of trauma, it was just the trauma of it. The women were so traumatized, they weren't up for doing coke and partying, and they didn't have the money to. They were just trying to get through their days. So it was a very different scenario. So yeah, by the time I'd moved to the last prison, I wasn't touching anything, and then I got pregnant, and that was the last time essentially I did any drugs apart from psychedelics. So I belong to the SPRG, Scottish Psychedelic Research Group. I'm on the board, and they're advocates for psychedelic therapy and legalizing psychedelic therapy. So we pitch down to Holyrood quite often and deliver speeches and try and get psychedelic assisted therapy legalized in Scotland. So I'd love to see that rolled out to women that are coming out of prison, try and integrate their traumatic experiences.
Amazing. That sounds like another webinar. We have
Indeed.
had 1 or 2 webinars on psychedelic assisted therapy, no, not specifically on women coming out of prison, which sounds like an interesting niche that needs to be discussed. No, thank you, that was interesting. One finally, and so then you're moved from Mexico City to, did you say you were in Holloway, to Holloway jail? And so how was that being back home, in the biggest inverted commas?
It was lovely. So with the first night we were back in Holloway, and I was put in what they call the first night centre. That's what they put, you know, it's the first place that goes, you go when you come back, and they put me in the first. So I arrived in Holloway in reception, and they offered me food, and welcomed me, and then they took me upstairs and put me in the first night centre, which had a bed, a duvet, a television, and they brought 2 meals to my bed. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And the other lass that was with me at the time in the first night centre, she was complaining, and I'm like, are you joking me? It was like a bloody hotel, you know, compared to what I'd been used to. It was just incredible. So I actually had a really nice run through the British prisons, I think, because I came back with such a, oh my God, this is bloody brilliant attitude. I didn't really encounter any problems. You know, Holloway was all right for me because I was studying and I was on the mother and baby unit as well. And then I went to East Sutton Park, which is an open prison down in Kent, and that was just fabulous. You know, it was supportive. I was allowed to study. I was allowed to go out to work. It gave me the time and space I needed to reintegrate myself back into society, because I'd been out a while and I kept making these horrendous faux pas, foot in mouth all the time. So yeah, it was a really good experience for me, actually. It was, I'm probably one of the only people that came out of a British prison going, no, that wasn't actually so bad. You know, yeah.
I think I never thought the idea of going to a worse prison first to then really appreciate a slightly less austere prison.
Count your blessings, you know.
There's one other it's an aside to your story, but it's something I'm curious of. I bet your flight back must have been surreal, where you'd been in jail and then suddenly I guess you were just on a normal seat, but with a police escort on like a plane where you get like 3 hot meals across it, and weirdly sort of like felt like a normal person for about 7 hours when being on it.
Well, it was quite hilarious because we got to the AFI, the federales in Mexico. They'd handed me over to the repatriation team, and the repatriation team came across as really hard-nosed to start with. They were like, there was no conversation. They were quite feisty. They were shutting me down when I was trying to initiate any conversation. I thought, oh God, this is going to be a miserable 12 hours, you know. And when we got to the airport, they cuffed me and took me up one of the things to get onto the plane. But of course, they had to take me past all the passengers. And all the passengers are watching, going, oh my God, who the hell? I think they were expecting some kind of axe murderer on the plane with them or something, you know. So we sat at the back and they wouldn't take my handcuffs off for ages. And eventually, about 2 hours into the flight, one of them just gave up, and they were like, oh, whatever. We were expecting someone really awful. We were expecting to come and pick up someone that was going to give us trouble. And they were like, but you're so bloody chirpy. I was so delighted to be going home. And, you know, and like you say, I was on a plane. I was having food. This is the first fun experience I'd had in years. So I was just absolutely buzzing. And I think they thought it was quite hilarious by the end of it. They were lovely by the end of the flight. But it took them some time to mellow out. It was an interesting experience.
Well, yeah, if the film does happen, I'm sure that will be a very surreal and enjoyable scene, the repatriation flight.
Yes.
I guess, yeah, shame you were too pregnant to ask for all of the free drinks that were that might have been on the plane.
That would have been an entirely different scene, I think. Yeah.
Probably handcuffs staying on, possibly, if the seats were coming out. So I'm going to pass back to Neil now. I'm guessing, Neil, that kind of prison isn't your main forte, as you're mainly kind of working, doing undercovering on the outside. If you've got anything to add to any of that, please do. I've also got a question from Rochelle Berliner. Just kind of moving away a little bit just on how our UK criminal justice system works with children. This really relates back to you earlier on talking about buying drugs from children, being in the presence of children when being interrogated by a drug dealer, and as you'd alluded to, how through the county lines phenomenon, the drug selling workforce has changed and their age is lowering, it seems. So, Neil, if you know, how does the UK criminal justice system treat the children dealers? Are they arrested and prosecuted? Drug dealers here in New York City also use children and adolescents to sell drugs and commit violent crimes because our system now aims to rehabilitate young people instead of imprisoning them. Could you talk a little bit more about children's involvement while you were working as an undercover? So I guess there's a little bit part of how we treated children then when it was a smaller issue, and how we treat them now when, at least according to media depictions, it is now a bigger issue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm basing this answer more on my activism and studies of the situation since I've left the police. And also, please bear in mind that I'm part of an international organisation. You know, LEAP is a big worldwide organisation, and we pool our thinking and expertise all the time. So I'm responding from an international perspective here, but also in terms of the way it's a political issue here in the UK. So one of the main reasons why certain countries have adapted, organised crime have adapted to use children, is because of this issue about the threat of prison sentences. And this is why actually the US was one of the first places, the wealthy countries, where children were exploited to deal drugs, because one of the big tools that law enforcement use is the threat of a big prison sentence. So this becomes a political issue where there's a drive to have bigger and bigger prison sentences. And part of the reason for that is that then the prison sentence becomes a transaction. It becomes a transactional discussion between the offender who is caught and the police officer interviewing them. It means that if you can threaten someone with a 10-year prison sentence, but give them the indication that if they provide some information, they can bring it down to 5 years, then this becomes the transaction between informants. And obviously, this is one of the things that drives the violence on the streets. This is one of the significant reasons why children become so useful, because most wealthy societies don't threaten to put children in prison for 10 years, and they can't do that. So you because of the age of criminal responsibility. Now, some countries are trying to adapt to this by actually lowering the age of criminal responsibility so that they can actually prosecute children. And that's what they're talking about in Sweden at the moment. So there is various responses to this, but overall, children are never going to have that same sense of threat, creating that transactional discussion. And more often than not, children will not be treated as a criminal at all, and they'll be released quite quickly. So that's really useful to organised crime. However, in the UK, because it's been a rapid descent into this horrors of child exploitation, policing has not adapted at all to the use of children. Children are routinely treated as criminals rather than victims, despite all sorts of not-for-profits and various people in the sector trying to convince the police that these are victims. And you can speak to many very forward-thinking police leaders who can articulate very well, actually, that we should be treating these children as victims primarily. But that doesn't play out in practice very often. It doesn't play out in how children are treated in the custody blocks, or at the time they're arrested, or at the time that they're strip searched, or the time that their houses are searched, or all of these horrendous things which are happening to children. They're still just essentially being treated through a criminal justice lens. And it's complicated, it's messy, it's adding to the trauma. We're creating a new generation of people who are going to grow up to be even harder-nosed criminals. And it's an unfolding disaster. It really is. It's a major crisis. And the trouble is that in terms of policy responses, in the current regime, there's actually very little we can do. Okay, we can have safeguarding teams, we can have people trying to talk to these children about trauma, but you can't change the fact that they're being exploited and manipulated because they've come from extreme poverty. You can't change the fact that many of these kids are being excluded from school because they're not white. So all of these causes you can't change. The only thing that's really going to change it is a complete change of drug policy to take legal control of the supply. That is the only way we can protect our children now, is legal regulation. And for heroin and crack cocaine, that's actually easier than any of the other drug markets, because you just have to take care of people who are in pain. That's how you take that's how you upend and the business model which is exploiting these children. So prescribe heroin to people who need heroin. The British system used to prescribe cocaine to problematic cocaine users to stabilize their life. We can look after people who are in pain and also protect children at the same time. You're on silent, James.
Thank you very much. Nearly had an entire webinar about speaking on mute. Someday. Thank you very much for that, Neil. And yeah, as Karen Moore pointed out in the chat, we have one of the lowest ages of criminal responsibility in Europe and going all around the world, we are strikingly low. I think it was a very much response to the killing of Jamie Baldwin, 91, in early 90s. We lowered it, and politically, it's easier to kind of have something that puts more people in jail than for any politician to stick their head above the parapet and bravely say maybe we should have less people in jail. And statistics not to hand, but yeah, even of our teenagers, we do send a lot of teenagers to jail and have a very large young offenders estate, which very much relates to all you were saying. Going back to the vague topic of youth, which I thought an interesting aside we got in the Q&A. Tracy Bradshaw said, you found that books really filled the void when you were in prison. Do you feel that school left you down until the age of 16 before you'd left home there?
Oh, very much so. So my household, there's a lot of mental health problems in my household, and at one point my mum had agoraphobia, and I was taking my little sister to primary school every day. I was late for school every day, and I don't remember anyone ever stopping and saying, "Hold on, Lucy, why are you late? What's going on?" There was just, I was either penalised or shouted at, or I think I was just one of these kids, because I kept my head down. I was a reader, I was quiet. I came from a house with lots of violence, so I tended to keep my head below the parapet. You learn that quickly, So I fell through the cracks. I completely fell through the cracks at school. I didn't know what I wanted to do. So when everyone else was deciding on colleges and careers, I didn't have a clue, because, Maslow's hierarchy, education wasn't on my radar at that point. I was just trying to survive my home life. So yeah, I think the school probably let me down a lot. I think one of my things that I study is the pathways perspective, how women in particular are victimized into crime. And I just think for me, I went to social services so many times. I went to the police so many times, help me. And they were just like, nah, everything's fine, go home. So when I did leave home, I considered anyone in authority, including the schools, to be my complete enemy. That was it. I'm not interested in anything you've got to say. I'm here with my new friends, and you can just leave me the hell alone. And I just dropped off the society radar, and that's how easy it is to, like you're saying it, Neil, you're breeding a whole new generation of the next problems. These are the kids. This is the pathways perspective. These are the kids that are going to go forward now and be your next drug users, be your next drug dealers. They're the kids now that are going to grow up to be your next generation of chaos. And we're doing that. That's something you can stop. There's a stopping point there which you can kick in, but it doesn't seem to be happening, does it? But yeah, for me, most definitely, that was, school very much let me down. I was really, really, yeah.
And so I guess quite an important epiphany once you were persuaded, once you get into studying at Holloway at the behest of this prison library officer. And one thing I find now, which is hilarious and traumatic at the same time, is when I'm reading all these criminological texts, and I'm sitting there and I'm going, well, damn, that's me, and damn it, I am textbook. And I quite often I just have to put the book down and just have a wee think. I'm like, I'm a stereotype, I am textbook. I read it and it's just my life playing out in the criminology textbooks, and it can be quite off-putting sometimes, actually. Must be very good for teaching, though, because some good relatable anecdotes to demonstrate the theory in real life.
Absolutely. One thing I do have is anecdotes, James. I've got plenty of them.
Cool. So yeah, thank you very much. And I'll say now for everyone, I think we're kind of edging towards the wrapping up point. So any questions you want to ask, please do fire them in. Since I think we'll kind of, we'll structure around those remaining questions now. And I'll move back to Neil. There's a few questions about LEAP. Actually, no, sorry, well, we're still there. Lucy JM has asked, did you have an art therapist at Holloway?
An art therapist? No, I've never had any therapist in my entire journey through prison. They don't. It's not something they tend to give you. I mean, they might do now, but they didn't when I was there. So sounds lovely, though.
Thank you very much. So now some questions about LEAP, the organisation you work for and represent, Neil. So one question is, can non-law enforcement get involved, or how can anyone if anyone likes the sound of them, I mean, I guess obviously visit their website. Is there a way to get involved, or simply subscribe to the newsletter, or what?
Yeah, I mean, it only law enforcement, only former or current law enforcement do the speaking, the public speaking, but the people who do the work, which get us those gigs, are the clever people, really, and they're the non-police people. So in Leap Europe, we have a board, and there's only me, who's a former cop, actually. So yeah, there's lots of people get involved. All of our volunteers around Europe. So our volunteers in Italy, they're not law enforcement. We've got about 4 police in France, several in Spain, but again, the person who works the hardest in Spain is not former law enforcement. So it's difficult because we're in a period of rapid growth at the moment, because we've done a load of events around Europe, but we've sort of grown beyond our capacity to cope with it. So we're always after more volunteers and more help, especially for organising events and fundraising, that kind of thing, because we're essentially a big organisation of volunteers, really. So we're trying to find funding to become more stable, because I believe that actually we have the key to changing policy, because wherever we have a public event, people listen to us because we're the cops, right? You know, we've been on this front line, and we can tell you the futility and the genuine nature of drugs policing. So I think we're key for the movement to win. You know, we are key to bringing change, but we do. So anyone offering to help, we very much appreciate it.
I've noticed. I've just put while you were talking, I had a quick Google. So I've put the UK Leap website in there. So I guess there's contact details. And I guess for anyone else, getting you on Twitter is probably quite good. Can you remind me of your Twitter handle? I should know, as I've.
Yes, it's at Woodsy0.
So WOO.
No, it's WUD.
UD. Oh, that's it.
Z00. I did that before I had
That's 00. So WUDZ00.
WUD.
Yeah.
ZEE 0.
Gotcha. Okay. So I've put them into that. So people who do wish to get involved in Leap can look at the website, can I presume contact through the website, and can contact you on Twitter.
Yeah, I should mention that in the USA we're much bigger. Mm-hmm. So for American people, the website there, as I say, I'm on the governing board for it, but I mean it's in the US it's quite a big not-for-profit organization with a speaker bureau of several hundred people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, noted. Thank you very much. And that was actually a 2-part question I asked. I've asked the first part, is from Sam Dunn. Second part is, and I think the answer is yes, did you write the book about undercover work inadvertently causing some homeless people to be killed with hot shots? So there was a part of it of, do you want to perhaps retell how that happened?
Yeah, that's my first book, Good Cop, Bad War, and there is a chapter near the end where I was working in Brighton, and so the business model, which now uses children, for a short time in the UK, there were some places in seaside towns like Brighton where they weren't using children, they were using homeless people as proxy dealers. And this was an adaptation, a defense against covert police tactics. So there were 3 gangs in Brighton. There was one from Liverpool, one Birmingham, and London. And they were each using homeless people as single points of contact. And so they would basically say, look, you're the single person contact for these collection of deals. If you bring anyone else close to us, we will kill you. And that was the word on the street, that actually several people who had been killed, who had overdoses, were actually people who'd been killed by organized crime. Now, I can't say for certain that is actually true, because that would take a full and detailed police investigation to conclude. However, what I can say is that there was genuine fear and genuine belief from many of those homeless people that there are being casual murders happening. And the problem that I had was, particularly for that operation, is that whereas I was dealing with lots of lovely people on the streets, my colleagues in the police for that operation were really obnoxious. They were not the most. They were a team of bullies, essentially. They weren't very nice people. So when I was talking about the serious nature of people dying and the suspicious nature of it, my response would be, oh, well, another one's died, maybe shoplifting will go down. It's no great loss. Just another junkie. That was the attitude from that particular team. So it was quite so to answer the question, yes. And I saw the chat, so there was a question popped up in the chat earlier on that it would make a film. Well, the development of good cop, bad warfare drama is currently paused because of the writers' strike. So, but theoretically, it's in development.
Exciting! I wasn't aware of that. See, I've read the good cop good cop bad war. So I very, very much look forward to the TV version of that coming out. So now there's a few questions which are kind of along the same lines, which I'll probably put to Neil first and then to Lucy, and then see if you've got any final tie-up. So they're kind of basically the, I guess, overall prohibition. Will it change? Will politicians do about it? So I'll read you two questions which both point in similar directions. One is from anonymous attendee who says, do the guests think that politicians and lawmakers are fully aware of the potential obvious solutions to the problems, but are just sticking their heads in the sand and kicking the can down the road just to avoid getting booted in the next election? So who is the problem going to get solved? And then another question from Lucky David. Neil, don't you think changing drug law or enacting an effective one will be very difficult, considering the fact that MPs, who are supposed to be the lawmakers, use these drugs as well?
Okay, is that to me first, James? Did you say?
I think you first. I think they're both very open. So yes, spill your heart out on those, and then I will ask Lucy to do the same.
Okay, so I speak to a lot of MPs, and most of them, where I've had the conversation around problematic heroin and crack cocaine markets and young people being involved in those, they had no idea, like most people you speak to, lay people, have got no idea of the connection between those two things. None at all. And they have no idea of the British system, the fact that providing a safe supply to problematic consumers, the impact that could have, and the evidence base for that from Switzerland, from the British system and various other places. So policymakers and politicians generally are completely naive to that until the point when it's explained to them. So, I've done many events in Parliament or hosted by MPs around the UK with anyone's child. And it's frustrating because once you have that conversation with policymakers and they get it, you can almost feel momentum starting, but we haven't reached enough people yet. We just haven't reached enough people. So again, if anyone out there wants to help host an event to involve their MP, we will come from Leap UK alongside anyone's child, and we will do an event and we will win over that MP. There's a real hockey sticks Tory MP in Plymouth called Flick Drummond, who had no idea, but she was won over to the idea of a health approach to these problems during the event. And it's quite interesting. Once you have access to an MP or a policymaker, quite often you can see just how much learning they're doing on the fly, really. So we just need to keep momentum. We just need to push this social movement and keep reaching people and keep talking about it. We will have influence. We will do, because change is happening. We can see it happening. The evidence from Switzerland isn't used adequately in this country, but it is there. And most importantly, it signposts us to tell us what's possible. These things are possible, so we just have to keep at it, I think. Did you say the second part was it's difficult, but I suppose have I answered both points?
I think one was specifically about how does the fact many MPs are known to use drugs, I guess, accelerate or slow down the move towards a less prohibitive system? Well,
I mean, there is an increasing number of MPs who are now on record as admitting that they've consumed drugs. And the interesting thing about that is because many of those people, like the younger Kinnock or Jeff Smith, they've admitted that for the right reasons, and there are quite a few of them now. Jeff Smith, for example, Manchester Labour MP, he has been on record saying, I used to DJ in clubs, I used to use MDMA, I used to enjoy it. And he's said that to move the debate forward. He's said that from a point of principle. And there are quite a few on record now. So I know, whereas many of us can lament the state of frontline politics at the moment, the shadow front bench seeming to be as intractably autocratic as the government. But behind the scenes, there are many of us activists, many of us who have been working very hard on these MPs. And there is a growing movement behind those front benches. And I'm optimistic. I mean, I have to be optimistic because I'm an activist, and I would probably end up being very miserable very quickly if I wasn't. But I think there's lots to be optimistic about. But we have, all of us in this space, all of us listening today, all of us involved, whether it's from academia, from activism, all of us need to see ourselves as one movement. All of us. We all have an equal role to play. I've got my stories, Lucy's got her stories, but we're all one movement. And if we keep seeing it ourselves as having the responsibility of growing that movement, we speak to our family, we speak to our friends, we share this knowledge, we share this understanding. That's the growth of movement, and we've all got a responsibility and a place to do that.
Awesome, thank you very much for that. So I think I'll finally now move on similar questions to Lucy. So I guess you've talked about your earlier parts of your life doing illegal activities related to prohibited drugs. As interestingly, you know, you can see that the edginess, the risk, the danger was some of the things that attracted you to some of the many worlds associated with drugs. Yeah, I wonder your views on, should they be legal? Will they stop being legal? If they were legal, would you have still done them or found a different sort of edgy work to do in those days? So yeah, I wonder if you've got any kind of 200-foot overview on the whole prohibition sort of question.
Well, I mean, it goes without saying I'm fully decriminalised, legalised, you know. I think if they'd been legal back in the day, I would still have taken them. I was a kid of the rave scene. That's just, you know, ecstasy, going to raves and taking ecstasy went hand in hand. So whether they were legal or not, I would have done them 100%. I really like altered states. I enjoy altered states. Obviously, I'm a PhD student. I work full time and I've got 3 kids. I mean, I don't socialise. Socialising isn't in my sphere at all. There's no time for that. But if I did socialise, I mean, I'd have no problem with altered states and with taking drugs. The only thing with me is I've been addicted to pretty much everything in the course of my life. I've been to rehab for all sorts. So anything I took would have to be non-addictive. So I mean, I'm literally limited to psychedelics and ecstasy. I think that would be yeah, absolutely. I don't see, I mean, the whole, like I said before, the scene's very much changed from when I was dealing or selling drugs, and I just don't think that I would have lost my train of thought. Sorry. No, the scene's very much changed. So because it's changed so much, I think the legalization, I mean, we wouldn't have had the county lines back then. That seems to me, like Neil said, a direct result of the crackdown, of the clampdown, to be able to get away from that kind of viciousness and the danger. I think you need to be able to legalize and decriminalize. It needs to be regulated. Coming from the point of view of an ex-addict as well, I would have appreciated the help. I was court ordered into rehab back in the day, but that extra help from I think being an illegal standpoint and not feeling criminalized would have gone a long way towards helping me at the time as well, I believe. I've always felt ever since I was a young one that I've been criminalized, and that's added towards this identity that eventually spiraled me into this chaos, self-admitted chaos. So I think to have that stigma, to have that label placed on you where you are stigmatized and criminalized for being a drug user, is very detrimental. So legalization and decriminalization obviously are the way forward for me.
Okay, thank you. I think that feels like a fairly good place to finish, unless you have any further tie-up comments from either of you. So I see shakes of there. So thank you very, very much. Really, really, really enjoyable to speak to you both. Neil, we've met before, we will again. I look forward to that. Lucia, I look forward to more anecdotes at some point if we can meet in real life or do another one of these webinars. And thank you very much to everyone listening. I'll give you one measure of how good a webinar this has been. We started off with 62 and now 1 hour and 39 minutes in, we have 53, and that's a tiny amount of attrition over more than an hour and a half. So that says everyone was fully keyed in and everyone felt the need to be here for all of it. So yeah, thanks everyone. We have another one coming up in about a month. We are not quite yet ready to announce. It will be on drug use amongst students and university drug policies, but that will be announced hopefully maybe in about a week. We're just finalizing things. I am just putting into the chat my email and my Twitter handle, so do please get in touch if you're interested in these, if you have an idea for a future one of these, or perhaps if you want to get in touch with a speaker, then you can email me and I'll say to the speaker, can this person get in touch? Do you want their email? So yeah, I've said thanks before, I'll say it again. It's been wonderful, really, really enjoyable. And yeah, everyone have a lovely week and hope to see you all again soon.